Welcome to the Arabesque Scissors YouTube channel. I'm Ali Phillips and today we're going to make the single and double fold bias binding that we need to make the smart sofa station. So we're going to use this beautiful candy stripe binding which we can make by cutting the fabric on the bias. This is double fold binding that we use for binding the base and the edges of the pockets, and this is single fold binding that we're using to cover the raw edges on the top. You can find the link for the pattern in the description below, and if you like sewing organisational videos, please consider liking this video and subscribing. And if you have comments for other organisational patterns you'd like me to design, leave me a comment. So bias binding is binding that is cut on the bias of the fabric. So I like to start by having my fabric face down and then folding up a corner so that we can trim this into a square shape. So whether you've got a fat quarter or a larger piece of fabric, you will need to square it up. So now just turn your fabric so that it fits on your cutting mat and cut it apart along that straight edge that you've just made there. So take the triangle shape that we've just cut and turn it so that it's in a mountain shape, with the point at the top and the fold at the bottom. And along the bottom here we have the bias stretchy edge. So with your ruler lined up with the fold and with the point, you're going to slice it down the middle. So now we've cut this into two pieces and we have a bias edge along here and a bias edge along here. And we need to open them out and then join them back together, so we will have the largest usable piece to cut maximum amount of bias binding from. So take the right hand piece and open it out so that you have the mountain shape with the bias at the bottom and the peak at the top. Then take the left hand side and open it out and turn it so that you have a valley with the bias at the top and the peak at the bottom. And then we can join these together down this seam so we can cut our bias binding. So just grab one of the pieces and place it right sides down until you get these seams aligning nicely. So you just offset your points so that when you sew your seam, your edges are going to meet accurately. So just pin these two layers together. And then just take this to the sewing machine and stitch from point to point. So now we've got a nice seam that we've sewn here that we've trimmed and pressed open. And now we've got a piece of fabric that's quite long and unruly looking. So we're going to fold this into a more manageable size. So just take the left hand piece and fold that point over to the right, lining it up along that seam line, and take that right hand piece and line that up to the top point, also along the seam line, just carefully manipulating it until it's flat. So just check that your biased edge is along the top edge, and you can check that by just giving it a little stretch, and also check the bottom edge also just by giving it a little tug. The piece is all ready to start slicing into sections. So now just turn your work 90 degrees so that you can start squaring up one of the edges and making a nice straight edge to start cutting your bias from. So just line up your ruler exactly with one of the folds, either at the top or the bottom, and check that everything's smooth, and then you can just slice off a tiny fraction just to make sure that you're starting with a beautifully straight and neat edge. Now just grab your work and turn it 180 degrees, and now you're ready to start slicing this into the sections that we need. For the Smart Sofa Station, we have two bias binding widths that we need to cut. So you just need to cut two widths of the narrow binding. And then you're going to cut three widths of the wider binding. So now we're going to join these wide strips of binding back together. So just open this one out and then open the second one out and make sure that these mitered edges are going to be fitting together. Take your right hand piece of bias here and flip it so that it's right sides together, and just offset it slightly so that when you sew along your seam your points are going to match together. And I also would like my stripes to match along here, so I'm going to move mine until I can see that my stripes are meeting. So just go ahead and pin that join together, just using a couple of pins. Then take that to the sewing machine and stitch from the top of the intersection down to the bottom. Then repeat that until you've joined all your sections together, and then roll it up and set it aside. So now we need to prepare the lengths of narrow binding that we're going to add the fusible backing to. So just measure and cut 3 lengths of the narrower binding here. So just cut 3 the same and make them about 1 inch wider than the width of the base. And you should be able to avoid any of the joins that you've got in the binding here, which will make for a even nicer, flatter, smoother finish. So moving on to making this single fold binding, I'm going to show you 2 ways that I'm going to do this here. So the first way is using the narrow bias tape maker. So you just feed that through using the little awl that comes with it to push it through. And then just grab your iron, tucking everything in nice and evenly, and just nice and slowly just pull that away from the iron as you go, making sure that everything's staying nice and flat and each of the sides are coming out evenly. And just pull that through, following the iron along closely behind it, just checking that you're getting it nice and even on both sides until you've done the whole piece. And that makes a beautifully neat and even piece of bias binding. Now if you don't have a bias tape maker, you can just eyeball this with your iron. So probably a good idea to turn your steam off so you don't accidentally burn your fingers. And just turn over one side at a time, trying to keep this nice and straight, try not to bend it, and just work your way along. And then just flip it around and press under the same amount on the other side. And this takes perhaps a little bit more practice than using the bias tape maker, but it's certainly quite possible to get a very nice effect if you haven't got one of these. So I like to turn my single fold binding into fusible binding by applying this steamer seam double-sided tape. This is just a really great way of turning something which can be quite unruly into something that is really easy to use. So just unroll a length of this and then just start carefully sticking it down the length of what you've got there. So I've just ripped off a piece there, and then with your iron just work your way along, just pressing it directly into the center with both of those raw edges that you've pressed under being caught underneath all of that. So just keep pressing really well, like the manufacturing instructions say. I've got lots of steam going here. And you've got a section of single fold bias that's now fusible and ready to use.